From the outside, the house looked like any other. A neat lawn, white curtains pulled back every morning, a small porch where sunlight settled quietly in the afternoons. Neighbors described her as devoted, a mother who never missed a school meeting, a woman who smiled politely and waved as she walked her child to the bus stop. To them, she was everything a mother should be. But behind the closed doors of that home, something else was growing, slowly, silently, and unnoticed. Her name appeared often in conversations, but always in a positive light. "She loves that child more than anything," one neighbor would later say. No one would ever suspect her. And that was the most dangerous part, because monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like mothers, a family that seemed normal. She became a mother young. Friends remember her excitement during pregnancy, how she talked endlessly about baby names, nursery colors, and the life she planned to build. When the child was born, she documented everything. First steps, first words, first day of school. Photos filled her social media. Smiles, birthday cakes, matching outfits. To the outside world, it was a portrait of love. But what no one saw was how much control she needed to feel safe. She corrected every movement, every word, every behavior. At first, it seemed harmless. Strict parenting, high expectations. But control, when left unchecked, doesn't stay small. It grows inside the house. The child learned early that silence was safer than questions. That obedience was rewarded, not with affection, but with temporary peace. Rules changed constantly. What was allowed one day became a reason for punishment the next. There was no pattern, no warning, and unpredictability is one of the strongest tools of fear. Investigators would later say this was not an accident. It was conditioning, a slow erosion of independence, a reshaping of identity. The child stopped speaking freely, stopped making eye contact, stopped asking for help. Teachers noticed changes. Grades dropped. Bruises appeared, always explained away. "She's clumsy. He falls a lot. Sensitive skin." And because the explanations came from a mother, they were accepted. Warning signs that went ignored. There were moments, small ones, moments that could have changed everything. A neighbor once heard yelling late at night. Another saw the child sitting alone for hours on the porch, staring at nothing. A teacher filed a report. It went nowhere. There was no history, no criminal record, no visible proof. And without proof, concern fades. That's how silence protects cruelty. The dual life. At school events, she was warm and involved. At home, distant and unpredictable. Psychologists later described it as compartmentalization. Two versions of the same person. One public, one private, and the private version held absolute power. Over time, the punishments became less about behavior and more about control, about reminding the child who was in charge. And love, once genuine, twisted into something darker, something possessive, something dangerous. The beginning of the end. In the weeks leading up to what would later shock the nation, tension inside the house escalated. Friends noticed she stopped bringing the child outside as often. School absences increased. Excuses piled up. Isolation deepened. Investigators believe this was not spontaneous. It was a build-up, a pressure cooker with no release. And when control begins to slip, when fear stops working, desperate people do desperate things. What happened next would force authorities to ask a terrifying question. How could a mother's love turn into a living nightmare without anyone stopping it? No one can say exactly when things cross the line. That's the unsettling truth investigators would later return to again and again. There was no single moment, no clear trigger, no sudden transformation, just a slow unraveling that happened quietly, behind walls no one thought to look behind. The shift no one noticed. At first, the changes were subtle. The child stopped being seen around the neighborhood. The once regular walks to school ended. Playdates disappeared. When questioned, the mother always had an answer. She's been sick. We're focusing more on homeschooling. She needs structure right now. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a pattern no one wanted to confront. Isolation is rarely accidental. It is often intentional. Control disguised as care. Inside the house, rules became stricter. Every hour of the day was scheduled. Every movement monitored. Every mistake magnified. The mother referred to it as discipline. Psychologists would later call it something else. Coercive control. It's a form of domination where affection is conditional and punishment is unpredictable. The child learned that compliance brought calm, but never safety, because safety required trust, and trust no longer existed. Emotional punishment. Not all harm leaves visible marks. Some of the deepest damage happens quietly. Silence became a weapon. So did shame. The mother would withhold attention for days, ignore attempts to speak, refuse eye contact. To a developing mind, this felt like abandonment. And abandonment is one of the most powerful forms of fear. Investigators later noted how this type of punishment creates dependency, a desperate need for approval from the very person causing harm. Love becomes something to earn. The child's world shrinks. As weeks passed, the child's world narrowed to just one person. No classmates, no teachers, no extended family. Only her. This isolation wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The mother controlled what the child heard, learned, and believed. Outside voices were described as dangerous. Authorities were portrayed as threats. Help was framed as betrayal. This is how fear replaces reality. Missed opportunities. There were moments when intervention was possible. A delivery driver noticed the child once, pale, withdrawn, avoiding eye contact. A relative asked why visits had stopped, but concern never turned into action, because the mother appeared calm, polite, articulate, and society is conditioned to trust certain appearances, especially when the word mother is involved. The pressure builds. By this point, control alone was no longer enough. The child was growing older, more aware, less compliant. Questions returned. So did resistance. Investigators believe this is when fear shifted into desperation. Control works best when the person being controlled believes there is no escape. But when that belief weakens, those in power often escalate. A private world of rules. The house followed a logic no one else understood. Punishments were arbitrary, rewards inconsistent. One mistake could erase weeks of calm. The child learned to stay still, to speak softly, to disappear when possible. But disappearance was never allowed, because possession was at the heart of it all. What neighbors heard. Late at night, raised voices became more frequent, doors closing sharply, movement upstairs long after midnight. But by daylight, everything returned to normal. Clean windows, trimmed lawn, a mother who smiled and waved. Duality is dangerous because it confuses witnesses. People doubt what they hear when it contradicts what they see. The breaking point approaches. In the final days before everything changed, behavior shifted again. The mother became withdrawn, agitated, obsessive. She canceled appointments, stopped answering messages, Investigators later described this as collapse, the moment when maintaining control requires more effort than the person can sustain. And when control collapses, outcomes become unpredictable. The silence before the storm. The house grew quiet, too quiet. No lights late at night, no movement during the day. Then suddenly activity. What happened inside that house during those final hours would later haunt everyone involved. Because by the time authorities became aware, it was already too late. A question that refuses to fade. When the case finally came to light, one question echoed louder than any other. How did so many warning signs exist, and yet no one stopped what was happening? Part 3 will explore exactly that. The neighbors, the institutions, the system that failed to intervene, and the clues that only made sense after everything was over. When the case finally came into the open, investigators were faced with a disturbing realization. The signs had been there, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, and yet nothing stopped what was happening. The first report, the earliest warning, didn't come from a neighbor. It came from classroom. A teacher noticed changes that were difficult to ignore, not dramatic, but consistent. A child who once participated now avoided attention. Assignments went unfinished. Eye contact disappeared. There were physical signs too. Nothing extreme, nothing definitive, but enough to raise concern. The teacher followed protocol. A report was filed. And then nothing happened. No follow-up, no visit, no intervention. In the system's eyes, the case lacked urgency. Why the system hesitated? Later reviews would show why the report stalled. There was no prior history, no criminal record, no visible pattern of repeated complaints. And perhaps most importantly, the mother was cooperative. She answered questions calmly, provided explanations confidently, presented documentation. To an overburdened system, she looked like a concerned parent being misunderstood. And that perception mattered more than the child's silence. The power of appearances. Psychologists often warn that abuse is hardest to detect when the abuser appears stable, educated, and composed. This case became a textbook example. The mother knew how to speak to authority. She used the right words, showed the right emotions. Concern, not anger. Worry, not defensiveness. She framed the child as sensitive, overreactive, difficult, and the system listened. Neighbors who looked away. Outside the house, small moments continued to raise quiet questions. Late-night arguments, unusual isolation, a child rarely seen. But none of it felt urgent enough to escalate. People told themselves comforting stories. It's not my business. Parents argue sometimes. I might be wrong. Silence doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from doubt, and doubt is powerful enough to stop action. Missed visits and closed doors. Records later revealed that a welfare check had been scheduled. It never happened. Staff shortages, higher priority cases, administrative delays. The visit was postponed, then forgotten. This wasn't a single failure. It was a chain of small ones. And chains are only as strong as their weakest link. The child's voice ignored. One detail haunted investigators more than any other. At some point, the child tried to speak. Not clearly, not directly, but enough. A comment made in passing. A sentence that hinted at fear. It was dismissed as exaggeration. Children, after all, are often told they don't fully understand what they're experiencing. That assumption would prove catastrophic. How control hid in plain sight. Experts later identified a key pattern. The abuse wasn't chaotic. It was structured. predictable to the person enforcing it, confusing to everyone else. They made it easier to hide. No emergency room visits, no obvious injuries, no dramatic incidents that demanded attention. Just slow, sustained harm, the kind that thrives in systems designed to respond only to extremes. A system designed to miss it. After the case broke, internal reviews painted a troubling picture. Each agency had done just enough to believe someone else was responsible. Teachers reported. Administrators logged notes. Social services marked the case as low priority. No one followed through. Responsibility dissolved across departments. And in that space, abuse continued unchecked. The mother's confidence grows. With every missed intervention, her confidence grew. She had tested the boundaries and found none. No one challenged her authority. No one questioned her version of events. Control deepened, and the child's world grew even smaller. By the time attention returned, the situation had already crossed a point of no return. When silence becomes complicity, this wasn't a story of one person failing. It was a story of how silence spreads, how hesitation compounds, how appearances override instinct, and how the word mother can become a shield no one wants to question. The case would later force policy changes, training updates, new reporting standards. But for one child, those changes came too late. The final missed chance. In the days before everything ended, there was one last opportunity, a moment when intervention might have altered the outcome. Investigators would later uncover it buried deep in paperwork. A call that wasn't returned, a note that wasn't flagged, a warning that arrived just a little too late. What comes next? Part 4 will focus on the final hours, not in graphic detail, but in chilling clarity. The sequence of decisions, the moment control collapsed, and the irreversible consequences that followed. Because understanding how it ended is essential to understanding why it was allowed to continue. There are moments in investigations that divide time into two parts. Before and after. This case had one such night. The final hours. What happened inside the house did not begin suddenly. It was the result of weeks, possibly months, of mounting pressure. Investigators later reconstructed the final hours not from eyewitnesses, but from fragments. Phone records, digital timestamps, and the subtle clues left behind. In a quiet home. Earlier that evening, the mother was seen alone. No visitors. No calls answered. The house lights remained on longer than usual. To neighbors, it meant nothing. To investigators, it would later mean everything. A breakdown, not an explosion. Contrary to public imagination, there was no dramatic outburst. No screaming heard. No obvious disturbance. Experts believe this was not an act of rage, but an act of control finally collapsing under its own weight. When authority is built entirely on fear, any sign of resistance feels like an existential threat. And that night, something shifted. The last known moments. At some point, the child was no longer moving freely through the house. Investigators would later avoid definitive language here, because certainty was impossible. What mattered was not the exact sequence, but the undeniable outcome. By the time silence settled, nothing inside the house was the same. The morning that raised questions. The next morning did not begin with panic. It began with routine, a delayed school absence, an unanswered phone call, an explanation that didn't quite align. The mother contacted authorities herself. Calm, measured, prepared. She reported a situation that required assistance, without offering details. That alone raised concern. People in crisis rarely sound composed. People in control do. First responders arrive. When authorities entered the home, they immediately sensed something was wrong. Not because of chaos, but because of how orderly everything was. Nothing appeared disturbed. No obvious estrago. No signs of urgency. But absence can be louder than disorder. And someone was missing. The shift in the mother's story. As questions increased, her answers changed. Timelines blurred. Details conflicted. Small inconsistencies began to stack up. Not enough alone, but impossible to ignore together. This was the moment investigators later described as the turn. The point, where concern became suspicion. A search begins. Authorities expanded their response. The home was secured. Interviews conducted. Records requested. Still, there was no immediate clarity. No clear crime scene. No definitive proof. Just a growing certainty that what had been presented was not the full truth. And that certainty carried weight. The weight of realization. Behind closed doors, investigators confronted the hardest realization of all. If intervention had happened sooner, this night might never have occurred. Every missed report, every delayed visit, every moment of doubt had led here, to a quiet house, to unanswered questions, to consequences that could not be reversed. The mother under scrutiny. As the investigation deepened, the mother's composure began to fracture. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Pauses grew longer. Explanations grew shorter. The image she had maintained for years was beginning to crack. And with it, the truth began to surface. What comes next? Part 5 will focus on what investigators uncovered next. The evidence they didn't expect. The psychological profile that explained everything. And the final conclusions that shocked even seasoned professionals. Because the real horror of this case was not just what happened that night. It was how long it took to stop it. The truth did not reveal itself all at once. It arrived in fragments. A timeline that didn't align. Statements that contradicted earlier versions. Silences where answers should have been. Investigators knew this kind of case well. Not because it was common, but because when it happened, it followed a familiar pattern. The investigation tightens. As the days passed, attention shifted from searching for answers to understanding behavior. The home was examined again, more carefully this time. Not for signs of chaos, but for signs of control. Everything had its place. Everything followed rules. That order, investigators realized, was not normal. It was intentional. Digital footprints. Technology filled in what witnesses could not. Phone records showed long gaps of inactivity. Search histories revealed patterns of obsession. Messages painted a picture of isolation. Nothing explicit, nothing obvious, but enough to show a mind under strain and a reality carefully managed. The psychological profile. Experts were brought in. What they described was unsettling, not because it was rare, but because it was recognizable. This was not cruelty driven by hatred. It was cruelty driven by possession. The belief that love equals control, that obedience equals safety, that authority must never be questioned. In that mindset, resistance feels like betrayal, and betrayal demands correction. The moment of collapse. Investigators concluded that the final night was not impulsive. It was the result of a system that could no longer sustain itself. Control had slipped. Fear had stopped working. And when a person builds their identity around dominance, losing it feels catastrophic. What followed was not chaos. It was finality. Accountability arrives. As evidence mounted, the narrative collapsed. Inconsistencies became impossible to explain away. Confidence turned into defensiveness. Composure gave way to silence. Eventually, responsibility could no longer be avoided. The image of a devoted parent gave way to a far darker reality, one shaped by manipulation, isolation, and unchecked authority. Aftermath. The case triggered widespread review. Protocols were questioned, reporting systems reevaluated, training standards revised, not because this case was unique, but because it revealed how easily similar situations could be missed, especially when they don't look violent from the outside. The question that remains, long after the investigation ended, one question remained unresolved. How many warning signs does it take before action feels justified? Because in this case, concern existed. Reports existed. Doubt existed. But intervention did not. The real lesson. This story is not only about what one mother did. It is about what everyone else didn't do. The neighbors who hesitated. The systems that delayed. The assumptions that protected the wrong person. Abuse does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind normalcy, behind politeness, behind love itself. A quiet ending. There was no dramatic conclusion, no sudden clarity, no resolution that made sense of everything. Just the understanding that prevention is always quieter than tragedy, and far easier to ignore. By the time the truth surfaced, it was already too late to change the outcome. Final thought. Cases like this force an uncomfortable truth into the open. Love, when twisted by control, can become something unrecognizable. And when silence surrounds it, the damage multiplies.